So these are small lights to add to your D&D terrain, and they are both powered by small CR2032 batteries. Now there's three ways that you can get your hands on these lights for your D&D and Warhammer terrain. Pre-printed resin parts are available from the Terraintronics Tindy store with a link in the description below. STL files can be obtained from Cults 3D, but also stay tuned on this video today to find out how you can do it in Fusion 360 and Blender and print the parts out yourself. One of the first things I started doing was looking for images, right? Google Images and so on, just to have a look at what kind of lighting we can expect in Dungeons & Dragons, inside the buildings and outside. I was looking for things like the shape of lamps. You can see a few oil lamps in this photograph here, and so on, right? You know, these are kind of more squarish ones in the background there. Candles themselves being used. If you actually look at the terrain itself, so I've got that Tavern D&D terrain. Again, this piece doesn't actually have any integrated lighting in it, but there are examples, if you keep on searching, where people have added outdoor lamps and so on. And so the things to consider are, you know, the different kinds of lampshades. So for instance, you know, I started looking here at outdoor lighting and some of the different types of frames there are and things like that, right? You know, something like this kind of maybe way too modern for what we're talking about. Something a little bit more square and so on. Something a little bit more like this might be more in our favor. So that made me think very quickly that we need to create, you know, different lampshades, and then, you know, obviously the wooden holders, wooden stands and so on for them as well. Pathway lighting, I think, can be incredibly effective when we look at Dungeons & Dragons because it can guide the way forward. So if we want our players to understand that there's a pathway that moves up and to the right, we can put a couple of little lights along the way. And as we dim the lighting in the room, you know, for environmental lighting, then that makes even more of an impact as we move along. One of the nice terms for searching here is to look up traditional pathway lighting. This magic word here, traditional, really just start to bring up different kinds of lighting and so on. And you can see kind of, you know, these kinds of holders along with either a circular lampshade or a very square one. We start to see a couple of patterns developing. And the other thing to consider here is in the shape as well. Bear in mind we have to firstly hold a battery, but also run power. We have to run two small wires up to any LED that we have as well. And that kind of guides us then into what the aesthetic is going to be. Thinking of, you know, what kind of pillar or post can I hang off the building itself? So that's something that's really a lot of work started going into. You know, maybe some kind of bracket that can integrate the wires as well. I started my design using Autodesk's Fusion 360. I use this because as a CAD program, it's not really designed for modeling, but more for dimensional CAD. And so I started off, you can see this as a bracket that's designed to get attached to a side of a wall. The length across here was about 5 millimeter, and this is 20 millimeters up. Again, you know, I had a ruler in hand. I'm looking at the models, you know, making sure I'm at scale and so on, and then extruded that out a little. And instantly I've got something that's starting to look a little bit more like a bracket. From there, I started looking at putting the right hole into the product for the wiring. And so what you'll see here is I'm starting to draw a hole on the end here, and you know, at the underneath here for the wires to come out for the actual lamp to hang down. Short extrude of that, but then I've got to get a wire to the wall mounting part. So copy this sketch over here and then burrow a hole through the product, and that's what you can see here, all the way through down to the end there. And then I started design of the initial lampshade. I'm designing it so that the LED can actually fit inside as well. That's something really, really important. Now, you know, once you've got that built up, then we have this very kind of boring shape. We need to put some wood texture into this and then decide if, you know, is this the only lampshade we want, or are there others that we want? I did a design with a Moroccan style lamp, or a more traditional square lampshade that might be easier to print. So you can see that here. And in this one, I imported a model of a 3mm LED and put the design around it. So I used that 3mm LED and then designed, you know, a gap around it. So for instance, here you can see I made a gap for the LED legs to come through, and opened it up a little just to compensate for any additional resin that gets printed down there. Now, if you are enjoying this video, please click the like button, subscribe and comment below. I love seeing your feedback and using your ideas and creativity as inspiration for products and upcoming videos. And now let's get back to it. So then I imported this shape directly into Blender. Now there's a couple of settings here for Blender that I've customized it to. For instance, it works in millimeters, not in meters, and a few other bits of scale and so on. But really what I want to do now is start to add some texture. I went into the sculpting menu. There's some tools here that we can use to add the grain for the wood. First thing to do is to remesh this, which is slice it up into smaller triangles. Now, this is all about the voxel size. So a pixel is a 2-dimensional size, a voxel is a 3-dimensional block. My resin printer can go down to 0.05 millimeter. So I'm actually going to make 0.025 so that we can do things quite granular. And I'm going to press enter and then come down to remesh. This is just remeshing this now from a very simple mesh. A simple mesh would have been one big square across there, for instance, one long rectangle down here and so on. What we actually want to do is to break this down into lots of smaller ones so that we can add the texture we want. There's two tools we want to use here, but one of the first things we want to do is take care of some of these edges. So what we're going to do is use the scrape tool, because in the real world, wood doesn't have beautiful, perfect bevels like this, right? It's just something traditional, so D&D timing. They wouldn't have had the CNC tools and so on for this. So we need to kind of mash this up a little bit. Now, one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to change this to scene. The radius itself is the size of the tool. So let's change the tool a little bit to be about that big. And then I'm going to change it to scene, so that any mashing up or anything I add on here is actually happening to the wood at whatever zoom I'm at. Otherwise, as I zoom in and out, the tool size changes. I'm trying to emulate, the choppiness that's been going on. Let's zoom in a little. We're trying to show that it's been chopped along and there's divots in some of it, as we go down. It's just starting to look a little bit more organic. The edges here have been, mashed away at and chopped with a coarse blade of some kind, it dug in a little bit by here and stuff. And it's funny, you don't have to be absolutely perfect with this, but it's amazing the difference it actually makes in your final. So there you go, you can see now that, this has kind of been mashed up along here, and you're going to do that along each of the sides here. It shouldn't take you more than 5 or 10 minutes. Next step, we are going to draw on it. You'll see I'm actually creating a texture, but the problem is it's coming out of the wood and not going into the wood. So I'm going to hit Control-Z to get rid of that. And now, while I'm marking this, I'm actually going to hold down Control. Control in Blender means, do the opposite or go the other way. So I'm going to increase the strength first. That's going to make it a little bit deeper. And then I'm going to hold down Control and start wood grain. Now, when I look at that, there's a few things that come to mind. One, it's a little bit deep. And two, it's a little bit wide. So let's undo. Let's change this down to like 0.3 or something like that and reduce the strength a little bit. And let's see now how this looks. Oh yeah. You don't want this to be a perfect line. What we actually want is for them to follow each other. And one of the things I like to do every once in a while is, add a variance like that. And you'll see why in a minute. Right, I'm going to add a little knot in the woodwork by here, and then obviously this is a piece of wood, so we're going to sort of try and tie this up as if it's been cut around the middle. Go from the end, holding down Control again, and this may seem crazy, it may not seem very clean right now, but as you do this more and more, what you'll end up with is something that looks really quite organic. The eye is very forgiving on organic stuff like this, I think. And then across here, of course, we need to show that this is a separate piece of wood. So I'm just going back and forth over the same point. Now, as you can see on the end cap here, we'll do the same again. So using this technique, we very quickly build up a texture around the product. Voila, right? So now I need to add some along the top here as well. Now, I'm not going to do the whole thing for you on this video, but hopefully this is building a picture for you of how you too can add wooden textures to simple Blender objects. But once you've done all of that, you should have something that looks a little bit more like. Here is one we kind of made earlier. I've textured it from all angles other than this back side because this is what's going to attach to the wall. Nice and easy. There's no hole on the front as we discussed, and you're able to run the wire down that and out. When looking at the lamps and the lampshades, one of the key things to consider here is, firstly, let's not forget we got to leave space for the wiring for the LEDs and so on. You don't have texture in metal like you do in wood, right? But the metal still needs to be hammered out and so on. So I still do this scraping effect to make it look like it's been hammered out. And so on. So that's something pretty important to continue doing, but you don't necessarily have to put like wooden textures and so on, because something that gets that hot would have even back then, right, had a blacksmith or something hammer it out. But once you've got those, then it's a case of importing that into your slicer, firing it up on the resin 3D printer, and off you go. Now, what good is an LED light without some kind of power source? Now, in a traditional sort of building or something like that, you could use one of the Terraintronics Kornoi boards or Carnarvon boards or one of the other boards to control lots of LEDs together at the same time. But if we're talking about doing something as simple as pathway lighting, then we really have to try and keep the power source built in. And so underneath here you can see there's a CR2032 battery. Now, I went to Thingiverse.com and saw this design by a user SK River or Scriver on how he was able to simply use the wiring from the LED to touch the actual battery rather than having to have a proper battery connector and so on. So I was really inspired by this design, and it's worth giving credit where credit's due. You can see here what he does is the negative side of the battery is a simple bit of wire that goes through the plastic, and that touches this side here of the battery, and then along the side then he brings the positive leg down so it just touches the side over here, and that's exactly what I've been able to do on this connected design. So in this case what we have is there's a magnet here that holds the battery in place, and then you bring the wire down and across, the negative wire down at this point, and then down the other side then you can see there's two holes on the side here. You bring down the positive terminal. Now, the nice thing about these CR2032 batteries is that they're built inherently a little faulty. They can't actually drive a lot of current. They can't drive a lot of power. And so you can hook them up to a single LED pretty comfortably without blowing the LED. That for a single LED, they really are quite convenient. And in addition to that, we can do the same thing with a larger base now, right? Same LED, these are flickering yellow LEDs. And in this case, the wires, I added some extension wires. They run up the leg, across and down. But in this case, the base is slide in. I can replace this battery easily simply by pulling it out, and you can actually see the metal contact there for the negative rail, right? So there we go, it's immediately back on and flickering. The output from all of this is a bunch of STL files that you're going to run on your 3D printer. Now, I'm fortunate enough to have an FDM printer, which prints out plastic, and a resin printer that allows me to print out some higher detailed items. So for instance, you can see here the lamp itself is printed out. Let's see if we can, there we go. So that's printed out, and you can see the texture on that is printed quite well. And that'll be attached to the actual base, right? I also have larger bases as well. So these are the sort of larger bases. Again, much easier to print onto and to hold the battery as well. And you'll simply glue and wire these in. There's a lovely hole in the bottom here that runs down and out the bottom. So in this case, in this little unit, what I actually did was I cut a little hole in the back here of the post and ran the wires out into the base. The earth was built up using a little hot glue to begin with, and then I added sand and then some static grass and some slates as well to make it look like it was all dug in. So there we go. I hope this has given you a good overview of how to create fixtures and fittings with wood grain in them. Of course, if you're looking for an easier path, then look in the description below for links to buy the 3D printer files from Celts3D.com, or alternatively, head on over to Terraintronics.com to buy pre-printed items that'll ship directly to your door. All those links and more are below. Any questions, please reach out on YouTube, Instagram, or on our Facebook page. And stay safe, and I'll see you next time.